Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. In this edition, we're going to explore the history of New York, particularly the history of African Americans in New York. And we're joined by a very distinguished author, scholar, and writer, Loren Katz. We want to welcome you to the Cultural Caravan.
Thank you for having me, Louise.
You know, Bill, if I may,
Fine.
Okay, you know, I have enjoyed reading your work over the years, and, you know, the question I have is, what inspired you to really focus on the topic of African American heritage?
Well, I was probably one of the few white kids in the world to grow up with books on African American history on living room shelves, because my father had a great interest in African American culture and history. He participated in groups like the Committee for the Negro and the Arts, did all kinds of volunteer work, actually even produced a play up at the Schomburg Library back in about 1948-49 with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and so on. So I had this unusual upbringing. And I took in black history before I got to high school. And I actually was writing on it in my days in high school. So when I started teaching public school here in New York City in the early 1950s, and I found that the textbooks just virtually omitted black people except showing them as chopping cotton and being slaves, I began introducing my own materials, and that then grew into my first book called Eyewitness, and then into a number of other books.
Well, you know, I know that you have written extensively, particularly on the history as it relates to African Americans and Native Americans.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, that's something I kind of stumbled on through my picture collection, that I would be looking at pictures of Native Americans, and there would be clearly people with African faces staring back at me in group shots. So I started to research it, and sure enough, I found there was an important history of the relationship between Native Americans and African Americans that began, well, I can trace it back to 1502, when Governor Ovando of Hispaniola complains that the Africans are running away and the Native Americans are taking them in, and they never can be recaptured. And what I think is happening is this is the first rainbow coalition that's taking place out there in the wilderness in the early days of the conquest.
You know, you really, by your work, have made a major contribution to the understanding of early history, because, as you stated, there is a need for clarification about the history of African Americans, the history of Native people, and the history of people who populated these shores. And one of the topics we're going to focus on is the history of African Americans in New York. As a native New Yorker, I've always been, you know, fascinated by the city and the energy and the culture, but definitely the history. And when I had the opportunity to read one of your books, which we have, The Black Legacy, where you have a history of New York African Americans, I was so fascinated because I said, this is the book that I'm looking for. Could you tell us what inspired you to really focus on that history?
Well, actually, it actually goes back to my father, because his great interest was in African Americans and in New York, because he was a native New Yorker, as am I. And he even had a wonderful picture collection, and he had a lot of first-hand accounts, and that's how I got into it. And particularly, here's the greatest city in the world, and it's always been portrayed as something that the British colonists came along and set up and did, and there's no mention of slavery, and I'd like to get into that in a while. But what I'd like to say by way of introduction to this, I think is important, is usually the African American presence in New York is put in the year 1526, when 11 Africans were brought over here and as slaves and put to work. But what my research found, and what I've written about in Black Legacy, is that actually there were Africans here before that. And we even have their names. One was Matthew da Costa, who came over here in either 1607 or 1609. Henry Hudson came in 1609 and claimed he discovered the place. So da Costa is really an important figure. And he was a trader for the Dutch and the French, And actually, he was so valuable to them that they had a court fight as to who had the right to his services. And then there was another fellow, Jan Rodriguez. Notice these are Spanish names, but these are people of African descent. And Jan Rodriguez, around 1509 or so, sets up, 1609, sets up a fur trading post dealing with the Algonquins. And once again, you can see it's the Africans who find it easier to deal with the Native Americans than the Europeans. And this is a pattern. That's why I wrote a whole book on that, because this is a pattern that people don't know about. A lot of the early translators brought here by the Dutch, by the Spanish, by the English were people from Africa. They picked up languages quickly, maybe because Africa itself, people in Africa were exposed to many different cultures and languages. Also, they had no racial prejudice, like the Europeans. The Europeans thought all the other cultures were not worth paying attention to. But the Africans paid attention to, listened to languages, and became really important interpreters. And by the way, an interpreter soon becomes a diplomat, because that's an important skill in dealing with others.
Now, you talked about that relationship, and also you talked about there were certain the people, as you said in your book, you mentioned that there were 11 Africans brought by the Dutch. Okay.
Correct.
And they basically, the Dutch had a certain way of treating their enslaved. Could you tell us the distinction of how you describe slavery under the Dutch?
Slavery under the Dutch has been called by the noted historian, poet, diplomat, James Weldon Johnson, a half-slavery. And that's because it was rather mild. The Dutch wanted to get work out of the Africans, and the Africans did an enormous amount of work here. They built Broadway. They built Wall Street. By the way, the half-slavery didn't mean they were so happy that they didn't try to run away. And some of them ran away to the north, some to the south. They joined the Algonquin Nation. They're up where Harlem is today. And this half-slavery went on. It's hard to explain, except that legally, black people in many ways were treated just the way the other Dutch were. They could often sue. They could join the church, the Dutch Reformed Church, and their marriages were performed in the church, and they could become members of the church and even were buried in the church burial grounds. So this changed, however, when the British came. The British brought a, what shall we call it, a watch the dollar kind of approach to slavery. Get the work out of them. Don't associate with them and control things. And of course the Africans, I think it's important to note, reacted to that the way any people would. They resisted. And there were slave revolts. There were several major slave revolts. One of them, I think, was 1712. Another one was 1741. In which they set fire to houses here in Manhattan, and when people came out to put out the houses, they attacked them and so on. They wanted to be free. They wanted to not be slaves anymore.